How does a man become a father? Jason Statham learned it. For 2 decades, Jason Statham had saved the world on screen. He'd defused bombs, outrun explosions, and defeated armies of villains with nothing but his fists and an unbreakable will. But on that humid August night in 2017, sitting across from Oprah in her Chicago studio, the man who had never shown fear was trembling. "Tell me about Jack," Oprah said softly, her voice carrying that healing quality that had comforted millions. "Tell me about the moment you first held your son." Jason's jaw tightened. His hands, the same hands that had thrown countless punches in countless films, fidgeted with his wedding ring. For 30 seconds, the studio fell silent. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion crossing his weathered face. "I was terrified," he finally whispered. The admission hung in the air like a prayer. This was Jason Statham, the transporter, the expendable, the man who made fear look foolish. And here he was, confessing to the world that a 7-pound baby had brought him to his knees. But this terror wasn't new. It had been growing inside him for 9 months, feeding on a childhood wound that had never properly healed. Jason Statham grew up in Shirebrook, Derbyshire, where emotions were locked away like dangerous weapons. His father, Barry, was a coal miner who believed tenderness was a luxury working-class men couldn't afford. "Men don't cry, Jason," Barry would say. "Men endure." Jason learned to endure. Love existed in their house, but spoken in pushed sandwiches and gruff be-carefuls. "I never heard my father say I love you," Jason told Oprah. "Not once. Not even when he was dying." The audience drew a collective breath. Here was a man stripping away 30 years of armor, revealing the scared little boy beneath. But there was more. The fear of becoming his father wasn't Jason's only terror. There was something else, something deeper that had haunted him through every relationship, every quiet moment when he thought about the future. "I was afraid I didn't know how to love," he continued. How do you teach someone something you never learned yourself? This was the question that had kept Jason awake during Rosie's pregnancy. While she slept peacefully beside him, her hand resting on her growing belly, Jason would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he was cursed to repeat his father's silence. Would his son grow up feeling the same hollow ache that Jason had carried for decades? The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent his career playing protectors and heroes was terrified of protecting and nurturing his own child. Oprah leaned forward, her eyes glistening with understanding. And then Jack was born. Jason closed his eyes, transported back to that moment. The delivery room. Rosie's exhausted but radiant face. The doctor placing a tiny, perfect human being into his massive hands. "The moment I held him," Jason said, "everything I thought I knew about strength crumbled." Real strength wasn't suppressing emotions. It was allowing yourself to be vulnerable. Jack's tiny fingers wrapped around Jason's thumb, and every carefully constructed barrier came tumbling down. "I started crying," Jason admitted. "And I couldn't stop. But not broken like damaged. Broken open like finally free." The studio audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the Jason Statham they knew from movies. This was a man unveiling his soul on live television. But the transformation wasn't immediate. Learning to be a father when you've never had an emotional roadmap is like learning to dance while the music is already playing. Jason stumbled. Often. The first time Jack cried in the middle of the night, Jason continued, "I panicked. I mean, properly panicked. Here I am, a man who's pretended to save the world for a living, and I couldn't figure out why my 6-week-old son was upset." Rosie had been exhausted from feeding, so Jason had volunteered for the 3 a.m. shift. But standing in Jack's nursery at 3 in the morning, holding a screaming baby, Jason felt more helpless than he'd ever felt in any action sequence. "I tried everything," he told Oprah with a sheepish smile. "Rocking, singing, God, my singing probably made him cry harder. I even tried doing some of my action movie voices, thinking maybe that would work." The audience laughed, and Jason's smile widened. Nothing worked, and then I just sat down with him, put him against my chest, and started talking. Not in any character voice, not trying to be anyone but myself. I told him about my day, about how much I loved his mom, about how scared I was to mess him up. And something magical happened. Jack stopped crying. Not because Jason had found some secret parenting technique, but because for the first time, Jason was being completely authentic. He wasn't performing strength, he was simply being present. "That's when I understood," Jason said, his voice growing stronger. "My father wasn't cold because he didn't love me. He was cold because he was scared too. Scared of doing it wrong, scared of being vulnerable, scared of breaking the rules about how men were supposed to behave." This realization changed everything. Instead of resenting his father's emotional distance, Jason began to understand it. Barry Statham had loved his son the only way he knew how. Through work, through provision, through the silent sacrifice of long days and dangerous minds. But Jason could choose differently. He could break the cycle. "I made a decision that night," Jason told Oprah. "I decided that Jack would never wonder if I loved him. Not for a single day of his life." And he kept that promise. The man who had made a career out of playing emotionally unavailable tough guys became the most present father he could be. When Jack took his first steps, Jason was there, arms wide open, tears streaming down his face. When Jack said "Dada" for the first time, Jason recorded it and watched it 17 times in a row. "I tell him I love him every single day," Jason said. "Multiple times a day. When I drop him off at nursery, when I pick him up before bed, randomly in the middle of playing with his toys. I tell him until the words lose their foreignness in my mouth." But perhaps most importantly, Jason learned to show his emotions in front of his son. When Jack's pet goldfish died, Jason didn't hide his own sadness. When they watched Finding Nemo together, and Jason got emotional during the father-son scenes, he didn't turn away. "I want him to see that men can feel deeply," Jason explained to Oprah. "That crying doesn't make you weak, that loving someone completely is the bravest thing you can do." The impact extended beyond just Jack. Jason's relationship with Rosie deepened as he learned to be emotionally available. His friendships became more meaningful. Even his work took on new dimensions as he began seeking out roles that allowed him to explore different facets of masculinity. "Becoming a father saved me," Jason said simply. "It taught me that the strongest thing you can do is allow yourself to be soft." Oprah nodded, her own eyes bright with tears. "And what would you say to men who are struggling with this same fear?" Jason was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Start with the truth," he said. "Start by admitting that you're scared, that you don't have all the answers, that you're learning as you go. Your children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. They need you to try." He paused, thinking of his own father, now passed, and the conversation they never had. "And if you're lucky enough to still have your father," Jason continued, "tell him you love him, even if he never said it to you, especially if he never said it to you. Break the cycle." The studio was completely silent, except for the soft sound of people crying. Tough guys in the audience were wiping their eyes. Mothers were thinking of their own sons. Fathers were mentally composing text messages to children they hadn't talked to in years. "Every night before Jack goes to sleep," Jason said, his voice now steady and strong, "I tell him he's the best thing that ever happened to me. And every night, he tells me he loves me too. And in those moments, I can feel my father smiling. Because love, it turns out, isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about showing up, scared and uncertain, but showing up anyway." Oprah reached across and squeezed Jason's hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for showing us what courage really looks like." As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, Jason sat for a moment in the quiet of the studio. Tomorrow he would return to London, to Rosie and Jack, carrying with him the lightness that comes from finally speaking your truth. The man who had spent his career playing heroes had finally become one, not by saving the world, but by saving himself. And in doing so, giving his son something more precious than any action sequence could provide, a father who wasn't afraid to love completely. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating the villain. Sometimes it's simply holding your child and letting yourself feel everything that comes with that perfect, terrifying, beautiful responsibility. But Jason's journey wasn't without setbacks. 3 months after Jack's birth, Exhaustion and work stress pulled him back toward old patterns. I snapped at Rosie during a call from Australia, Jason told Oprah, his voice heavy with regret. Jack was babbling data in the background, and instead of joy, I felt irritated. That night, he called his mother. She said something that changed everything. Your father used to call after his bad days too, love. The difference is, you're calling to fix it, not to justify it. The next morning, Jason video called and apologized to both Rosie and Jack. This taught him that being a good father wasn't about perfection. It was about accountability. The real test came when Jack turned 2 and entered what every parent knows as the terrible twos. Suddenly, Jason wasn't dealing with a compliant baby, but a strong-willed toddler who seemed to test every boundary. Jack threw the most spectacular tantrum in Tesco one day, Jason told Oprah, chuckling. Full body on the floor screaming because I wouldn't buy him chocolate. Everyone was staring. Jason's first instinct was to do what his father would have done, issue stern warnings, raise his voice. But something stopped him. I got down on the floor with him, Jason said. Right there in the cereal aisle. I sat cross-legged while he screamed and just waited. People were filming, but I didn't care. When Jack exhausted himself, Jason held him close. I know you're frustrated, mate. Sometimes we want things we can't have, but throwing things doesn't help. Let's breathe together. That video of Jason Statham sitting on a supermarket floor, calmly comforting his screaming toddler, went viral. But more importantly, it became a defining moment in Jason's understanding of strength. Real strength isn't dominating your child into submission, Jason explained to Oprah. It's staying calm when they're in chaos. It's being their safe harbor, not another storm. The conversation turned to Jason's evolving relationship with masculinity itself. Growing up, he'd absorbed the message that men should be providers and protectors, but never nurturers. Fatherhood shattered that limited definition. Jack loves it when I paint his nails, Jason said with a grin. Bright pink, usually. Some people have things to say about it. Oprah raised an eyebrow. And how do you respond? I don't, Jason said firmly. My job is to raise a son who knows he's loved unconditionally and feels free to express himself however makes him happy. This philosophy extended to how Jason approached discipline. Instead of the authoritarian because I said so approach he'd grown up with, Jason chose connection over control. When Jack misbehaves, and he's 2, so that's often, I try to understand what he's really communicating, Jason explained. Usually, it's not defiance. It's a need that isn't being met. Maybe he's hungry, tired, overstimulated, or just needing connection. Jason shared a recent example. Last week, Jack bit another child at nursery. Instead of reacting with anger, I knelt down and said, "That must have been really big feelings. Let's figure out better ways to show people when we're upset." The result? Jack learned emotional regulation skills, and Jason learned that patience is a superpower. Every day with Jack teaches me something new about myself, Jason reflected. Yesterday he asked me why I was sad. I'd had a difficult conversation with my agent about a role I didn't get, and I realized I had a choice. I could brush off his question, or I could model emotional honesty. Jason chose honesty. He sat down with Jack and explained, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes adults feel disappointed when things don't go the way they hoped, and that it's okay to feel sad for a little while. Jack listened very seriously, Jason said, his voice softening. Then he went and got his favorite stuffed elephant and brought it to me. Ellie makes me feel better when I'm sad, he said. Maybe Ellie can help you too. That moment, Jason told Oprah, encapsulated everything he hoped to achieve as a father, raising a child who was emotionally intelligent, empathetic, and unafraid to offer comfort to others. He's teaching me as much as I'm teaching him, Jason concluded. Maybe more. As their conversation drew to a close, Oprah asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What do you want Jack to remember about his childhood with you? Jason was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with thought. I want him to remember feeling safe, he finally said. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Safe to feel whatever he's feeling, safe to make mistakes, safe to be exactly who he is. I want him to remember that his father showed up. Not perfectly, but consistently. Jason paused, then added with a smile. And I want him to remember that his old man cried at Toy Story 4 and wasn't ashamed of it. The audience laughed through their tears, but Jason's message was profound. Authentic masculinity includes the full spectrum of human emotion. As the interview concluded, Jason offered one final piece of wisdom. Being a father isn't about being the strongest man in the room. It's about being the safest man in the room. For your children, for your partner, for yourself. The man who had spent decades playing invincible heroes had discovered that true heroism looked different than he'd imagined. It looked like showing up authentically, loving without conditions, and having the courage to be vulnerable in a world that often equates vulnerability with weakness. Jason Statham had learned to be a father, and in the process, he had learned to be free.